Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Haints podcast, brought to you by Recavit Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. Blackbeard. The name alone was enough to strike fear in the hearts of all seafaring men of the time. But very few facts are known about the first 2/3 of his life. Even his real name is a mystery. We know that he most often went by Edward Teach, but there were almost a dozen names that he also used. Some claim that his name was Edward Drummond, but there is no verified documentation of this. No one knows the name he was born with. I wonder, at the end of it all, if he even remembered it himself. It's believed that he was born sometime around 1680 in Bristol, England, which meant that, for the majority of his life, all he knew was war. Britain evoked on King William III war with France from 1689 to 1697, and then almost immediately began Queen Anne's War with Spain, which was fought between 1702 and 1713. Blackbeard undoubtedly served in at least one of these, but to what extent is not known. It's thought that this is where he learned his seamanship and naval battle tactics. But death wasn't the only thing he was educated in. Contrary to his lack of manners or appearance, he was a very well-educated man. He could read and write, which was a privilege that only the socially elite were given. He also attended formal gatherings, and among his friends were governors and high-ranking political officials. He was educated enough to discuss a wide range of topics within this circle. Blackbeard was a formidable presence. By all reports, he was 7 feet tall and had a large, muscular frame. Picture Shaquille O'Neal with a temper and hair. Lots of it. Blackbeard was defined by his black, bushy, unkempt hair, eyebrows, and yes, a beard. The revolver had not yet been invented in Blackbeard's time, and reloading was a tedious task in the best of times, and downright suicidal in the throes of battle. Blackbeard wore a wide belt and crossed bandoliers around his broad chest. Within their loops, he held several daggers, his favorite cutlass, and between 4 and 8 single-shot pistols. He would tuck cords of hemp around his hat so that the ends hung down beside his face and then lit them to add a fierceness to his appearance. This was not as dangerous as it may sound, as hemp wicks burned very slowly, 12 inches an hour. There was rarely a waking moment when he did not have a drink in his hand. His tolerance for rum is said to be unmatched, and there was never a time when he was so drunk that he couldn't fight. When he really wanted to intimidate people, he would sprinkle gunpowder on the tip of his rum, light it on fire, then down the entire thing. It was his love of drink that spawned the encounter that ultimately led to Blackbeard's demise. A merchant trader named William Bell was out in the Pamlico Sound with his son and a young Indian boy. At about 3 a.m., they were startled by the sound of a larger boat approaching them. The men on board were obviously drunk. Their boisterous laughter carried far across the water. As the two boats passed, the tall skipper of the large boat stepped aboard Bell's boat without invitation. "Give me brandy," the tall stranger demanded. "Who are you, sir? Where do you come from?" Bell asked. "My name is Thatch, and I come straight from hell. I shall soon take you thence if you don't fetch me some brandy." It was Blackbeard himself. After a short struggle, Bell and the two boys were subdued, and their hands tied behind their backs. Blackbeard then towed the smaller boat deep into a swampy tributary and left it there, but not before plundering the vessel. Blackbeard took several items, including 66 pounds sterling, a unique silver cup, and half a keg of brandy. Bell's boat was left stranded without sails and oars. Once he reached land, Bell vowed revenge on Blackbeard. But what could he do? If you recall from our episode on Bath last season, England had offered a pardon to any pirate who would turn themselves in and swear to stop all criminal activities. Blackbeard had received his pardon from his good friend and governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden. Bell knew that if he went to Eden, or any of the local sheriffs, that his complaint would fall on deaf ears, or worse, bring on the full wrath of Blackbeard. So he petitioned for aid from Alexander Spotswood, Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. Spotswood had been a colonel in the British Army prior to being appointed lieutenant governor. He didn't agree with or honor the pardon agreement. Any pirate found in his territory, even those trying to turn themselves in, would immediately be arrested, and it was exceedingly rare for someone on trial for piracy to escape his court with their lives. Now, personally, I have a few questions for Mr. William Bell. First of all, if we assume that Blackbeard was up to no good by being out at this time of night, then what the hell was Bell doing? He claimed to be trading. Were the folks he traded with up at 3 a.m.? If so, none of them were around for the confrontation between Bell and Blackbeard. And then there's the sum of 66 pounds sterling that Blackbeard stole from him. Experts don't agree on the value of 1,700 sterling in today's dollars. Calculations range from $25 to $600 per sterling. The general consensus is that Bell's 66 sterling would have equated to $2,000 or $3,000. That sounds like a lot for a common trader to be walking around with. And finally, how did Bell know the secret location of Blackbeard's ship? It doesn't seem like knowledge the general public would be privileged to. I mean, sure, Blackbeard usually treated his North Carolina neighbors kindly, and in return, they saw him as some kind of folk hero, like Robin Hood. But even Robin Hood had enemies, and I'm sure the ship's location would have been a closely guarded secret. Bell and Blackbeard lived in relatively close proximity to one another. They traveled the same waterways daily. Surely, they were familiar enough with one another to know how to avoid the violent conflict that ensued. What made this night different? Was Blackbeard simply in a bad mood and intolerant of Bell's questions? Or had Bell had all he could take of Blackbeard's bullying and intimidation? Some people think that William Bell may have been motivated by something larger, pure human greed. Blackbeard lived large. He had other homes besides his mansion in Bath, and he spent money freely. Still, by all accounts, there were millions of dollars worth of loot unaccounted for. It had to be hidden somewhere. There was some cash and gold found in his house, of course, but nowhere near the amounts he was reported to have. In the 300 years since his death, every inch of his property, and Teach's Hole, and anywhere that people could think to look, have been searched. Nothing. Many people believe that he worked out an arrangement with William Bell to hide his vast fortune in the swamps of eastern North Carolina. What if Bell saw the altercation as a way of getting Blackbeard out of the picture and keeping the treasure for himself? It's clear from his correspondence to England that Spotswood had been conspiring against Blackbeard for a long time. Blackbeard had claimed his pardon, but it was widely known that he continued to pirate and plunder the waters outside of North Carolina. Even so, Spotswood was forced to make his plans in secret because there were those in his own administration who would have warned Blackbeard of any forthcoming attack. And now that he knew the location of Blackbeard's ship, he was ready to strike. He had hired 2 large sloops, the Jane and the Ranger. Spotswood then contacted Captain Ellis Brand for the men to crew them. Brand provided British Royal Navy Lieutenant Robert Maynard to help the Jane and a man known only as Hyde to head the Ranger. He's known simply by Hyde because he was so historically insignificant that we couldn't find his full name. Lieutenant Maynard was in charge of the ships. Maynard set sail from North Carolina in hopes of catching Blackbeard unaware. Meanwhile, Brand marched troops to Governor Eden's doorsteps demanding to know the pirates' whereabouts. Brand came away empty-handed and then looked to rendezvous with Maynard. He sent canoes toward the Pamlico to locate the lieutenant. The canoes returned and reported that Maynard had already engaged in battle with Blackbeard and was victorious. On November 22nd, 1718, Maynard spotted the Adventure, Blackbeard's ship. Blackbeard saw the two warships approaching and assessed the situation. He had a skeleton crew on board. Many of the crew had already left and received a pardon, and several other crewmen were in Bath on leave. He was left to just 18 men. Through his spyglass, he saw that the two ships were also crewed by a minimum of men. He also noticed that the warships had no cannons like Blackbeard had 8 cannons on board the Adventure. And Blackbeard knew these waters better than anyone. Blackbeard decided on a running engagement. He sailed on, while continually firing his cannons at the two ships. Maynard was extremely motivated. Spotswood had implied a promotion for Maynard if he was successful. And then there was the matter of the 400-pound reward, approximately $15,000 by today's standards. He steered the ship directly toward Blackbeard's, while Hyde flanked them to the left. What the two warships lacked in cannon fire, it made up with pistols and rifles. The crewmen opened fire on Blackbeard's ship, but at this range, neither side gained much of an advantage. Blackbeard's ship was smaller, lighter, and more maneuverable than the two sloops. He could easily outrun the larger ships, but he didn't become Blackbeard by running from a fight. He stayed just outside of their range until they reached the spot he was looking for. Without warning, Blackbeard took the wheel from his quartermaster and turned the ship directly toward the shore. The quartermaster was shocked and grabbed him by the shoulder. There was no time for explanation, so Blackbeard simply punched the man in the face, knocking him to the deck. By the time the man regained his feet, Blackbeard steered the ship sharply right. Now the quartermaster saw the genius of his plan. Blackbeard had positioned their ship so that there was a sandbar hidden under the water between the Adventure and the warships. Following the attack, both sloops were grounded on the sandbar. They could easily make the adjustments needed to free themselves, but it would take 10 or 15 minutes, during which time they would be sitting ducks. Blackbeard lined their ship up broadside to the larger vessel and opened fire with all 8 cannons as fast as they could be reloaded. Maynard managed to free the Jane from the sandbar, but not before Blackbeard's cannons had killed half his men and damaged the ship. The Ranger, however, had taken the brunt of the attack. Mr. Hyde was dead, along with almost all of his men. The Ranger leaned over on its side, no longer seaworthy. Now there was nowhere to go. Blackbeard maneuvered his ship to pull up alongside the Jane and board her. The ships bumped each other at low speed, and the pirates quickly lashed them together, as they had many times before. But instead of immediately rushing aboard, Blackbeard had one more surprise for Lieutenant Maynard. He had taken empty rum bottles and filled them with gunpowder and scraps of lead. Finally, he threaded a fuse through the cork. A hand grenade. After the grenade attack, there were just a few men left on the Jane, Maynard himself and a handful of crew. Blackbeard called to his men.
"They're all knocked on the head but 3 or 4. Board her and cut them to pieces."
Blackbeard then shouted to Maynard.
"Damnation seize my soul if I give you any quarter or take any from you."
"I expect no quarter from you, nor shall I give any," Maynard returned. It was at this moment that Maynard unleashed a surprise of his own. He had held half of his men in hold below decks. With Blackbeard on board, Maynard sprung his trap and at least 20 fresh men scurried onto the deck. The result was confusion, just as Maynard had hoped. Quote, "Every man engaged in the hand-to-hand combat that ensued knew that his own life was at stake. It was kill or be killed, a deadly struggle for survival. On both sides, the men fought furiously. There could be no stopping because of a wound. Many skidded or fell off the blood-slicked deck, but regained their stride and relentlessly sought to close with their foes amidst the bang and smoke of pistols, the clashing of swords, the shrieks of the wounded, and the groans of the dying." End quote. The bodies were stacked up around them, and one man recalled that the ship was stained red. Finally, Blackbeard met Maynard again during the fighting. The two men hesitated for the briefest of moments while they squared off with one another. Simultaneously, they both drew pistols and fired. One of Maynard's men rushed Blackbeard and knocked him off course. Maynard's round, however, found its mark and tore into Blackbeard's body. The wound did not faze him, and he continued to fight. The men fought with swords. The standard military blade of the time was a saber, light, fast, and maneuverable. But Blackbeard preferred his cutlass. What it lacked in speed, it made up for in cutting power. The cutlass was much heavier than the saber, cutting deeper. At some point in the battle, the two swords clashed together violently. The heavier cutlass sheared Maynard's saber to the hilt. Blackbeard reared his cutlass back for the killing blow on Maynard. Maynard hurled the hilt of his sword at Blackbeard's face, buying him a few seconds to draw and cock another pistol. But before he could aim, Blackbeard had recovered and started the motion of swinging the heavy cutlass toward Maynard's head. Suddenly, one of Maynard's men attacked Blackbeard from behind, slicing a huge gash in his neck. The attack caused Blackbeard's strike to miss Maynard's head, glancing off the man's knuckles instead. The wound was not so bad that Maynard couldn't fire his pistol, hitting Blackbeard once more. And still Blackbeard fought on, blood flowing freely from the gaping wound in his neck and 2 bullet wounds. Blackbeard fought on. He was weakening, though. Maynard's men saw that Blackbeard was nearing his end and circled him, each one stepping forward to stab, slice, or shoot him. And finally, the man known as Blackbeard collapsed dead on the deck of the Jane. Maynard inspected Blackbeard's corpse and wrote it in his report that Blackbeard had been shot 5 times and cut over 20 times, and thus ended the life of the most infamous pirate who ever lived. Except, he still had one more venture to embark upon, or at least his head did. Maynard needed proof of his kill. He cut off Blackbeard's head and tossed his body overboard, where, legend says, it swam 3 circles around the ship before sinking into the black waters of the Atlantic. Blackbeard's head was hung from the bowsprit of the Jane for all to see as Maynard sailed to Bath. Now, if you're like me, you just ask Surrey, what's a bowsprit? It's the long beam that sticks out of the front of an old sailing ship, like a unicorn horn. Legend says that as Maynard held Blackbeard's severed head aloft, it silently mouthed the words, "Bell, bell, bell," over and over, like he knew who had betrayed him. There are some who claim to see a very tall apparition out of the waters of the Pamlico Sound in the early pre-dawn hours. Sometimes a specter is seen standing in a ghostly rowboat. Occasionally it appears as a man floating a few inches above the water, like the early morning mist. And sometimes nothing is seen at all, but rather heard. You see, regardless of the form of apparition, its message is always the same. One word: bell. Back to Blackbeard's head. It remained lashed to the bowsprit until they finally docked in Hampton, Virginia, to meet with Spotswood. Maynard and his men scoured the Adventure for any letter or document, or map, anything that revealed the location of Blackbeard's treasure. They didn't find anything. They did, however, find a unique silver cup, William Bell's cup. The cup was proof that Bell's account was, at least partially true, and that Spotswood's actions were justified. But the lieutenant governor wasn't very happy. He was counting on Blackbeard's treasure to recoup the cost of the operation, which he had paid for himself. As a result of Spotswood's anger, Maynard did not receive the promotion he was promised, or the 400-pound reward. But Spotswood could not deny that Blackbeard was, in fact, dead. So both prizes were awarded to Captain Brand instead of Maynard. Blackbeard's head was impaled on a pike and set at the entrance to Hampton River as a deterrent to other pirates. Today, that spot is known as Blackbeard's Point. There was a group at the time known as the Brethren of the Coast, made up of former and active pirates. It was an informal group, but highly respected among pirates. If there was an authority that Blackbeard acknowledged, it would have been that of the Brethren. And it was said that Spotswood never again set foot in England because he feared his brotherhood would attack any vessel he boarded. He may have been right. Soon after Blackbeard's demise, from almost every seaside bar and seedy tavern through Virginia and the Carolinas, the phrase "Death to Spotswood" began to circulate. Soon it became the unofficial password of the Brethren. It's not known precisely how long Blackbeard's head sat on a pike. Some say it was just a few weeks. Others say that it remained there for years, after all trace of flesh had fallen away, until the sun and the salt-driven wind had conspired to bleach the bones white. However long as it was, the skull ended up in the hands of a member of the Brethren of the Coast. He cut the skull in half through the eye sockets, creating a drinking vessel with two indentations where the tops of the eye sockets were. For years, it was on display at the Richmond Tavern in Williamsburg, and if you knew the right words, it was available to drink from. After leaving the Richmond Tavern, the skull was never seen publicly again. But supposedly, it was covered with plated silver, inside and out, and engraved "Death to Spotswood" on the side of it. And it was given a name, Blackbeard's Cup. A bit ironic, really. Our story begins with William Bell's silver cup and ends with Blackbeard's silver cup. Arthur Charles Wedby, in one of my favorite coastal tales of folklore, claimed to have drank from the cup during a very ritualistic ceremony on Ocracoke Island. But that was over 80 years ago. Where could it be now? Has it been passed from one wealthy Virginia family to another over the years? Is it, as some claim, stored in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts? The museum claims to have a skull fashioned into a bowl, but it's not on display, and the museum will not verify whether or not it's Blackbeard. Has it been lost in one of the many hurricanes to have hit the Carolinas? Or, as others suggest, was it all a myth? Another tall tale about a man who was larger than life. To learn more about these stories, check out Blackbeard's Cup and Other Stories of the Outer Banks by Charles H. Wedby. There's also Blackbeard the Pirate, a reappraisal of his life and times by Robert E. Lee. And don't miss Best Ghost Tales of North Carolina by Terrence Sepke.
Jumped in the river, what did I see?
This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran and was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything that Jeff's up to at his company at adarkerworld.com. And you can find everything that we're up to at recapitproductions.com. You can learn more about this show and the upcoming Carolina Haynes book at our website, the new and improved carolinahaynes.com. Don't forget to like our official Facebook page at facebook.com/Carolina Hanks. You can follow us on Instagram at Wreak Havoc Productions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. Please take a minute to subscribe to this show. Leave us a review and share it with your friends. Everyone has that friend that loves creepy stories, so take a minute and share it with them. I'd also like to take a minute to invite you to check out a few other podcasts. I was recently a guest on the Strange Carolinas podcast to discuss the Wreak Havoc Horror Film Festival. I'm also featured in an upcoming episode of Arcane Carolinas to talk about this show and the upcoming Caroline Haynes book. Both of these are wonderful shows that explore familiar ground to listeners of this podcast, but in decidedly different formats. Check them out today. You can reach me directly at wreakhavocproductions@gmail.com. I love hearing from listeners of the show. Let's keep the feedback coming. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about those things that go bump in the night.